Well, greetings, everybody. We are very excited to welcome you all to the Reimagine Innovation Session, Pre-Harvest Testing for Lettuce and Leafy Greens, hosted by California LGMA. My name is Amanda Griffin, Vice President of Education and Program Management here at United Fresh. Now, before we kick things off, I want to remind you of a few session logistics that you're probably all very intimately familiar with after this year of Zoom. So as you can see, we're all in Zoom meeting. So you all have the ability to turn on and off your cameras, as well as mute and unmute yourselves. We would love it if you kept your camera on during the presentation, but please mute yourself so we don't have any background noise. We welcome questions throughout the presentation and will be taking them at the end of the presentation. So please, as you think of them, type them into the chat box, and Dr. McIntyre will be monitoring them to ask them of our presenters as we move forward through the presentation. And lastly, as you can see, this session is being recorded, and we will send out that recording in the near future. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to our speakers for today, Greg Komar and Tim York, who will kick things off. Greg and Tim, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Amanda, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending some time with us this morning to learn about the LGMA's new risk-based pre-harvest testing action plan that we've developed recently. I am Greg Komar. I'm the technical director from the California LGMA. Just want to point out that today's session is focused on California LGMA actions. We do have two LGMAs, the Arizona and California LGMAs, but this session is focused mainly on what the California program that will be implemented here in the near future. As a technical director, my role at the LGMA is to help our industry members implement our food safety metrics or requirements. I've been with the LGMA for about 2.5 years now, but been in the industry for more or less 25 years in various roles, including research and development, regulatory compliance, auditing, training, etc. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim for a quick intro, and then we'll get started on the presentation.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim York. I'm the CEO of the LGMA. I'm fairly new to the LGMA, but I'm long in the tooth with the industry. Been in the produce industry for over 40 years and been involved in food safety for a number of those last 25 or so years. What we'd like to do this morning is just, as Greg said, talk about our pre-harvest testing program that we put in place. You may know that we initially provided our members with guidance around pre-harvest testing back in April, shortly after the FDA report was released about the outbreak in the Salinas Valley. But we've taken that a step further, and Greg and I will explain that a little bit as we get into the presentation. April, could we go to that first slide, please? Let's go to the next, if you would. April, the next slide. There we go, thank you. So, you know, the mission of the LGMA, and as Greg said, I won't keep saying California, but we're really speaking on behalf of California LGMA. But our mission is to bring farmers together to make lettuce and leafy greens safer. It's really the essence of who we are and what our mission is, the safer greens. You know, we do that through a number of different ways. We do it through metrics changes, guidance that I mentioned. We do it through research that's conducted at Center for Produce Safety and the longitudinal study that FDA has commissioned. We make lettuce and leafy greens safer through the work of our technical committees, led by our technical committee chair, Sharon Lanini from PIM, where we bring together expertise from within the industry and outside of the industry to make sure that we have the latest and best information about how to keep lettuce and leafy greens safer. We work closely also with the CFIA, the FDA, the CDC, and a few more acronyms that you probably can think of. But again, I just wanted to emphasize that really what we're all about is making lettuce and leafy greens safer. April, next slide, please. So California LGMA members represent about 70% of the nation's lettuce and leafy greens production, and we estimate somewhere around 30 billion servings per year come out of the LGMA members. The next slide, please. Again, so how do we work towards safer greens? We do it really in three different ways. One is to verify the food safety practices that are in place and reinforce those through government audits that are conducted by the CDFA, the California Department of Food and Ag, who have all been trained by the USDA. And then, being a member of LGMA requires a commitment to continuous improvement. And I don't think maybe our members get enough recognition for that, but they really are handing over their farming operations to LGMA and trusting that we're going to make decisions on their behalf that better the industry, even though it may cost them some additional money or additional steps. They are required to do continuous improvement. And you ask perhaps why would they join the LGMA? I think there's a number of different reasons. One is simply the recognition within the marketplace. We again estimate we have about 99% of the leafy greens coming out of California are under our program. But there's recognition among the handler members and growers, distributors, retailers, food service distributors, government agencies about the effectiveness of the LGMA. There are actually 62 different marketing programs within the state of California related to agriculture. We are the unique one that deals with food safety, and again, narrowly on lettuce and leafy greens. And to me, it really demonstrates the commitment on behalf of our members who want to follow best practices, learn from each other. The 400 plus family farmers that make up the LGMA, communications, training, the resources and support, number of things that we provide for our members and growers to help them get better and understand how to comply with our requirements and most of all, really make lettuce and leafy greens safer. Let me thank United this morning for this forum and this opportunity to talk about this, and also for all of you that are listening. I appreciate your time today. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Greg.
All right, thanks, Tim. Well, I thought it would be appropriate to kind of just give you guys some context about where we are. And, obviously this discussion is about our risk-based pre-harvest testing protocols, but it's really important to kind of emphasize what's been going on the past few years in the LGMAs collectively. And it's really boils down to, since 2017, there's been just a concerted effort to, as Tim mentioned, continually improve our metrics based on latest science and information, based on other actions that have been taking place. As you can see here on this quick timeline, since 2018, we've made some pretty substantial changes to our metrics regarding different things, whether it's adjacent land, water use, environmental assessments, harvest best practices, harvest sanitation, traceability initiatives. I mean, there's the list here goes on, and they've been pretty substantial, dramatic changes regarding just our food safety standards. And if you think back to where we were in 2007 when the LGMAs actually started, it's been a tremendous change in the past 4.5 to 5 years. In particular, the past 3 years have been extremely significant. So I just want to put that in context when we talk about pre-harvest testing, because pre-harvest testing to some degree has been part of the LGMAs for some time now, actually. So with our water standards, when there was an issue with meeting some of our water metrics originally, some of our requirements did state that pre-harvest testing was a potential way to understand if your water systems were actually functioning as intended. And so pre-harvest testing has been something that's been part of our metrics for some time. And this is really just the next iteration or the next step in moving forward with making pre-harvest testing really, when we think about it, it's a risk-based approach. So I want to make sure this is very clear. We're not talking about pre-harvest testing for all lettuce and leafy greens during every single harvest. That's really important to get straight up front. This is a risk-based approach, and we'll obviously talk a little bit more about what that means here shortly. But we don't require all leafy greens to be tested at pre-harvest. The other thing that's really important to point out about this initiative here is that it's really about learning. It's really about getting more information for the industry and using that information to, again, for this continuous improvement. We'll kind of harp on that a few times as we go through this presentation, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone on this presentation, everyone that's attending this presentation understands that the LGMAs have been going through a continuous improvement. We have a lot of subcommittees. We work very closely with other associations, with the research industry, with the states and federal regulatory organizations to really try to improve our metrics. And it's been an ongoing process for the past few years. Next slide, please. So, we're going to get now into a little bit more detail about what the new requirements are. But, this first slide really should say standardizing risk-based pre-harvest testing, because it's really about risk assessments. It's really about understanding what's going on in your surroundings. And that's really been our initiatives for the past few years, is to make our metrics based on risk. It's really based on what we know are the potential problematic areas, whether that's in our environment or actually on our farms, and then dealing with those on an individual basis. And so some of the things that we are working on, again, in 2021, we have new risk assessment tools, we have new guidance materials. All of these things are based on this risk-based approach. And so it's really important, again, to really make sure that you guys fundamentally understand that we're trying to make all of these new standards based on risk, okay? And the risk that we perceive and that we know as an industry. Next slide, please. So as Tim mentioned, in April, our board gave us a direction. So as Tim mentioned, we have these committees. We have a technical committee in the California LGMA led by Sharon Lanini. And one of the things that the board wanted us to do was to create guidance around when should pre-harvest testing be conducted. What are some of the risk-based, what are some of the ideas that could potentially enhance risk regarding our farms? And so this was our first initiative, was to create this new guidance for the industry. And that was to be used as the guidance for when our industry should be performing risk-based pre-harvest testing. The other thing our board wanted us to do in April was to conduct a survey with our industry to try and understand just what are they doing now when it comes to pre-harvest testing? How prevalent is it? How are people actually conducting it? What are they doing regarding if they find a positive? Those kind of questions. What is the aggregately, what is our industry doing? And we actually, we achieved that survey. The survey completed in about the first or second week in June. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of those results on the next slide. And really what we want to emphasize is this survey that we conducted, go to the next slide, April. This survey that we conducted really, it was really eye-opening for us, but it wasn't something that was completely new to us. We knew that the industry was doing pre-harvest testing to a pretty significant degree, but what we found was that a substantial amount of our industry is actually conducting pre-harvest testing. As you can see here, nearly 90% of the respondents conduct pre-harvest testing on an average month. Now, of course, there's some of the devils in the details here, right? But, aggregately, what we wanted to get out of the survey was, is our industry doing pre-harvest testing? And basically what we found out is yes, and they're doing it to some degree based on where our methodology is going today with this risk-based approach. Next slide, please. So some of the things that came out of the survey that we thought was important to kind of, for people to understand, and it's really, again, we'll talk a little bit more about, what is our approach moving forward. But most of our respondents indicated that they're doing testing within 4 to 7 days of a harvest. Sampling is done by third-party or outside companies, right? So again, when you think about resources and things of that nature, timing, right? How is this done? Because it's impactful, right? It helps us to understand what type of initiatives can we move forward. Sampling is done predominantly using what we call the Z pattern. Now, as we know with research and other information that we've gathered recently, a Z pattern isn't necessarily the most effective way of doing testing, but it was important for us to understand what people are doing and why, right? Sampling blocks are typically 1 acre, but a vast majority are doing between 1 and 5 acres. Again, very important for us to understand, because that was basically what our original guidance suggested was to have your sampling blocks or sampling lots within 1 to 5 acres. And as you can see here, a predominant amount of our industry was doing that. Testing is done using a 60 sample N equals 60 type sampling plan, and tests were being performed, or the organisms that we were looking for were predominantly O157H7 and Salmonella. So again, kind of what our guidance was suggesting. Next slide, please. And of course, you know, that the other slide that we had showed, you know, Dan Sutton, basically everyone understands that when it comes to pre-harvest testing, it can be a very important tool for us, but we all understand as well that while we believe this is going to help push our metrics and help improve food safety, we also know it's not a silver bullet, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, as far as the survey, some more information from that survey, the majority of our respondents have not had pre-harvest test results come back positive within the last 12 months. And so if you think about that, right, that was a very important input, you know, it was a very important point with our survey. So when we're looking at what do we do moving forward to make sure that our test results are actually indicative of what is happening in the environment, that is what some of the development tried to achieve, right? Some of the numbers that you're about to see with our sampling methodology and sampling requirements go into, you know, basically, you know, we'll talk about some of the resources that were used, but if you look at the United Fresh, what was it, the thought survey that they conducted, or not the thought, what was it, the thought, I can't remember what they call it, but the thought survey. And then also we used some other resources such as Trevor Suslow, we used Michael Stotzowitz from Illinois, some other folks to kind of help us guide the development of this new standard. The idea behind it is, at the end of the day, when we look at sampling and what our results are trying to achieve, the idea is when we get a result, we want to have confidence in the result so that when we have a result, we know if it's positive, we can know which implicated lots to deal with. We can then know where to do our root cause analysis. And we also understand some of the other factors that may go into whether some of that product that had the positive from a certain lot, maybe some of the equipment needs to be cleaned, maybe there's additional buffering that needs to happen, or maybe there's other verification steps that we need to take place. A lot of this information that we kind of conducted in order to make these new protocols was really developed using some of the survey information that we that the results showed us previously. So next slide, please. So moving forward, after the survey results came back and we know where we landed, we really wanted to then look at, okay, what do we want to do? Next slide, please. So in July, our board mandated that the industry require pre-harvest testing, but we also mandate that it has to be based on risk. So these are the 4 tiers of our program right now. Perform risk assessments, right? So as I mentioned before, we have to perform risk assessments, but we're going to perform risk assessments based on this new guidance that we developed in April. Once we perform this risk assessment, if our risk assessments deem that pre-harvest testing is required or necessary, then we must do it, right? And that's going to be one of the tenets of our audits moving forward. If a risk assessment shows we must do this testing, the members must do it. Now, the most important thing, of course, is what happens when we get the results, right? So in the case of negatives, one of the approaches to this new testing, this testing methodology that we're developing is that it's going to be standardized, right? We want to make sure that we have a mechanism for the industry to do the same thing regardless of who you are, so that when we get a result, we can have confidence that those results have meaning, right? And we want to use that information to help us improve our metrics moving forward. But of course, if there is a positive result, our metrics now require a root cause analysis is conducted with those results, right? And so the idea, again, we had root cause analysis as a precursor to our water treatment metrics that we updated in 2019 and 2020. And now we're just moving that forward with pre-harvest testing for risk and for enhanced risks as well. We want to make sure that when we do find a positive, we do as much as we can to determine why that positive occurred, so that again, we can help improve our metrics and help understand what's going on in the environment moving forward. And then of course, lastly, when we are conducting these pre-harvest test results, when we do our audits of our members, we're going to actually verify that they're doing this. So again, if our pre-harvest tests are conducted, if there was a positive, our audits will also show if that root cause analysis was conducted as well, and potentially in the future, we can share those results as an industry and maybe make improvements to our metrics. Next slide, please. So some of our enhanced guidance deals with animals, obviously, in the past year and a half or so. As we know, with the FDA investigations that have been occurring, there's been a lot of suggestions that animal operations are some of the sources and reservoirs for some of this E. coli that's been found in the environment. Of course, that is what it is. But one of the things we want to also point out that while our guidance documents do focus a lot on animal operations adjacent to our farming operations, they're not the only consideration, okay? So it's important to understand that yes, our guidance does currently focus on animal operations, and some of the things that we consider are the distance from the animal operation, water runoff potential, wind and weather events, and of course, fill fly infestation. But we also want to emphasize that one of the things we want our industry to do is not only when we're conducting our normal risk assessments, which we conduct pre-season assessments, pre-harvest assessments, and we also do daily harvest assessments, we want to also promote doing risk assessments when something has changed in your environment, right? So whether that's in the growing environment or the adjacent to the growing environment, when something has changed, we also want folks to really understand what that change could potentially mean, and it may mean the need to do additional pre-harvest testing. So that's something that we really want to emphasize here. It's about information and about change, right? If there's a change that you believe as the grower or the handler has enhanced risk, we want you to potentially conduct pre-harvest testing in order to determine, are your mitigations effective? Is your food safety plan effective, right? We want to make sure we understand that moving forward. And if for some reason you get a positive and that root cause analysis shows that maybe something isn't as effective as it could be, we can then do remedial action and potentially do something different or better, or share that information to understand why, all right? Next slide, please. Now, as far as what the new requirement is, it doesn't change too much from what the original requirements were for water-based testing, pre-harvest testing, but there is a few significant differences. The first is the target organisms. We are targeting S-Tech, specific to E. coli 0157H7 and Salmonella as before. The timeline is still 4 to 7 days before harvest. We like to say scheduled harvest. Obviously, our harvest schedules can change for many reasons, whether that's weather, quality, or other issues. And so 4 to 7 days before scheduled harvest. Now, here's where some of the specificity comes in. We are asking that when a risk-based testing is to be conducted, that the lot to be tested is no greater than 1 acre, all right? And that the sample mass must be 1,500 grams at least. And from that 1,500 grams, the entire 1,500 grams must be analyzed. Of course, remedial actions are always, they've been, we have a precedent for remedial actions in the LGMA. If there's any positives, that lot cannot be harvested for the fresh market. That's been a kind of a staple for the LGMA for a long time. But there's more to it than that, right? The remedial actions also require root cause analysis to try to understand where that positive came from. Next slide, please. Now, this is just for demonstration purposes, but this may be how sampling is conducted on these 1 acre plots. So if you think about a 1,500 gram sample, there's been a lot of questions of the industry. How are we going to get our labs to actually enrich and test a total of 1,500 grams? Well, most methods that we know of do not allow for a total of 1,500 grams to be tested at one time. So the idea is moving forward that subsamples would be taken from that 1 acre lot, and it could be 4 subsamples, it could be 5 subsamples. It depends on what your lab's methodologies are allowed to do. But at the end of the day, what we presume is going to happen for a majority of our industry is that each subsample will have a maximum size of 375 grams. If you think about the N equals 60 number, we're going to most likely prescribe a minimum of N equals 60. So if you were to break up a 1 acre plot into 4 sublots, that would be 15 grabs to make a total of 375 grams per sample. So if you can see here, this is for demonstration purposes. This isn't necessarily how everything is going to work. They're obviously not just square fields and all of that, but this is just to give you an idea, a picture of how this might actually be implemented and work. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the remedial actions, as we mentioned, are very important. If pre-harvest tests come back positive, the product obviously cannot be harvested for fresh market. Now there's, some folks will question, what about the adjacent lots? What about buffers and all those types of things? That type of guidance is still being developed. Our partners from Western Growers are obviously are the ones developing this Appendix C that we use for our guidance for pre-harvest testing. We can obviously talk a little bit more about Appendix C during the Q&A, but at the end of the day, again, from a precedent perspective, the 1 acre sample, any positives come out of that 1 acre, that 1 acre cannot be harvested for the fresh market. And of course, we must conduct, again, a root cause analysis. Now, as far as the LGMA is concerned, we have already started developing root cause analysis guidance. We have what's called Appendix R that's already published to help with how to do root cause analysis. We have also been in partnership with Western Growers to develop a more industry-wide root cause analysis document that kind of shows when and how to do root cause analysis. And of course, there's a lot of other organizations out there developing root cause analysis guidance and resources to help us as an entire industry, not just the leafy greens industry, but the fresh produce industry, to conduct root cause analysis moving forward. Next slide, please. So of course, we're kind of harping on a few things here, but we really want to make sure we emphasize if we want to prevent future outbreaks, we need more information about how contamination is happening. And this is some of the reasoning behind this risk-based approach, 1,500 grams, N equals 60 per acre. We want, again, a uniform way for the industry to conduct pre-harvest testing. We want those results to be uniform. We want the results to be meaningful. And we want them to be able to be used to analyze what's going on in order for us to improve metrics moving forward. Next slide, please. Love it or leave it. This is something that we're gravitating to, this statement here, testing and learning, right? I think as an industry, we do a lot. As Tim mentioned earlier, we're involved with the Center for Produce Safety. We're involved with a lot of subject matter experts. We go to a lot of the trade shows regarding updated information, whether it's IFP or the California Leafy Greens Research Board. At the end of the day, we still know there's a lot of holes in our information, hence the reason for a longitudinal study, for example. But we know that if this approach is taken, if it's done uniformly, if it's done in the manner that we're expecting it to be done, we will definitely have more information for the future, and we can learn and adapt our metrics as we move forward. So that is really a driving goal for these changes. Next slide, please. So, lastly, of course, as we all know, testing is not a silver bullet. We're not proclaiming it is. We also understand, as I mentioned, we are not requiring testing of all lettuce and leafy greens at all time, right? It's based on risk. But the goal, again, is to gain valuable information, to perform these root cause analysis during a positive, to help try to understand where some of these positives are coming from, and to, again, keep moving our metrics and requirements forward so that we have the best metrics moving forward with the information that we have. And with that, I think that's the end of our presentation. Jennifer, we're happy for, oh, I'm sorry, we have one more. Tim, actually, maybe you can talk to this one. I think this is better for you.
Sure. Thank you, Greg.
Q&A.
So the CFI, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, we've been in discussions with them for many months, we realized how difficult it was for our folks to work within the requirements that CFIA put in last year for finished product testing. So we've had very good discussions with CFIA. They broadly support the efforts that we've made around putting risk-based pre-harvest testing in place. And they've stopped short of endorsing it because we don't really have a finished document yet, but we're hoping in our continued discussions with CFIA that we would be able to do pre-harvest testing per Appendix C that Greg was just explaining, that would be an alternative to the finished product testing requirements that they issued last year and they intend to issue again this year. So we will keep industry updated on that as we're having discussions with CFIA and finalizing with our partners, Western Growers, the Appendix C, but we believe we're on track to meet that expectation of CFIA. With that, Jennifer, I think we're back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Tim. I'm Jennifer McIntyre with United Fresh, and I see the questions coming in. There's already been some discussion in the chat, so I would encourage everyone to open the chat box and look at some of the questions that have already been answered, although I will try to aggregate and summarize a few related to methodology. But before I do, one of the overarching questions is, where can people find the details of this pre-harvest sampling? So where can people go to see it in writing and get more information? Tim, I'll ask you.
Yeah, I don't believe that's published yet. Is that correct, Greg? I don't believe it's published yet because it's not a finalized document. We're still seeking input from outside experts. We're providing input on it as well, but it will be posted up on Western Growers site as well as on LGMA as soon as it's finalized, and we look forward to being able to share that.
Next question I'll pose to Greg. You used the taxonomically correct Salmonella enterica, even though most people usually skip the enterica and go right to the serotype. So there was a question about why only enterica, which I think is a result of this taxonomical quirk related to Salmonella. So I'm assuming that when people are looking for Salmonella, the expectation is that they are looking for all Salmonella, and the Salmonella we think of. And then there's a related question, does serotyping have to be done either as part of the initial testing or as part of root cause analysis?
Thanks, Jennifer. At this moment, serotyping is not required. Obviously, from a serotyping perspective, that's a decision each individual company needs to make. There's benefits to doing it, not to doing it, as we all know, but at the moment, that is not a requirement of the LGMA or of the guidance document.
Great. Another set of questions, Greg, that I'll throw to you. There are several around this 1,500 grams, and is that a composite? Is it 1,500 grams per sample? Is it up to the lab to divide those 1,500 grams in 4? What can be composited at what point in time? And it may be an overarching question is, whose decision is that? So is there a standardized or recommended test method that's going to be used, and how should one work with their laboratory to make sure that the testing is done appropriately?
Yeah, no, great. That's a great question. Obviously, that's been a discussion moving forward. In general, I just want to like high level. So the 1,500 gram sample needs to be taken. The most practical way that we see that happening moving forward is to take subsamples. So not to have the lab segregate the 1,500 grams into the sizes that would work for them. So whether that's a 375 gram sample, 300 gram sample, 120 gram, 25 grams, whatever your lab does and the methods that they use, it may be more beneficial for you to do that. But at the end of the day, the underlying underlying requirement is that the entire sample weight be analyzed. And so how that is achieved with the methods that you're going to use with your lab is something that you need to decide. And again, we understand that sampling is a very unique process. As we saw in our survey, there's a lot of third-party folks doing sampling. And so, depending on how many bags are going to be used and, the whole process itself, there's a cost analysis to that as well, depending on how they want to do it and what the lab's willing to do for them. And so that's something really to bring up with your lab. Now, as far as methodologies are concerned, the guidance in itself is really talking about some of the how-tos and does give examples of what to consider when methodology are used. But I will say this, that the LGMA in partnership with Western growers will be developing a lot of resources and training to go along with this guidance moving forward so that we can more concretely answer those questions. So I don't want to tell anyone right now, like, what is the best method? I don't know that answer, to be honest with you. But frankly, we understand that the relationships you have with your labs are more critical than ever, making sure you understand that the methods that you use are accredited, are approved. And that's really how the LGMA functions. We just mandate that something is approved in the sense of whether that's a United States approval, think of FDA BAM or EPA or an international recognized standard. Those are the high level ways that we stipulate things be used. But when it comes, again, the devil's in the details, and that's going to be a discussion that each individual member or grower is going to have with their lab.
Great. Tim, maybe I'll ask the next question of you. Is there any expectation either now or maybe in the future that test results would be shared within the industry, within the LGMA?
Our industry has made multiple efforts, as you know, Jen, to try and pool data, anonymize and pool data so we can learn from that. We are hoping that, and I should say those have been unsuccessful to date. But we're one of the few industries, if folks read the editorial that I wrote in the Packer several months ago, there was an article about airline safety and the difference it made when all those carriers pooled their information and shared that with the FAA so that that data could be analyzed. And if we are going to continue to keep data within silos like we do today, we're not going to learn from each other, which is one of the most valuable lessons we can get from pre-harvest testing, is learning about our own ranches and our own farms, but also from others and what they learn and experience. We are hoping Western Growers has a project underway for data collection. We are hoping that growers will participate and share information with them. We've got a database that we are developing here to handle our audit information. We hope to be able to analyze that information in the future and learn some things from it. But it's really incumbent upon the industry itself to make sure that we are taking advantage of the data that is being accumulated and learn from that. As Greg emphasized, test and learn. And if we're just not sharing, we're not taking advantage of the information that is accessible to us. So we hope that that will take place.
Great. Another question, Greg, I'll ask you. You've been talking about testing pre-harvest. Has there been any discussion of testing post-harvest? And then there were also some questions around, in addition to product testing, is there any discussion of testing like harvest equipment? We're thinking on the listeria side, things that are done in facilities, or has the discussion really been limited to this pre-harvest testing for these two organisms?
Yeah, quite frankly, Jennifer, it's been limited to pre-harvest testing. And the reason for that is a fewfold. The first one is the scope of the LGMA. So we're really a pre-farm gate food safety standard by intention. So our marketing agreement does allow for some pretty broad implementation of our requirements for the leafy greens industry, but we've intentionally focused on the pre-farm gate. And so when it comes to post-harvest type of testing, that really is beyond our scope and what we currently want to do from an auditing and verification perspective. Now, as far as testing, at harvest or sampling of harvest equipment in that, again, it goes back to a similar light, right? To do that type of analysis at harvest would require a test and hold program at facilities, most likely, depending on how quickly you'd get results back from a test result. And so that has been something we haven't initiated because we know that some of the logistical challenges that go along with that as an industry. But currently, our focus is to really, it's kind of, I don't want to call it baby steps, because our industry has, as a survey showed, has been doing a lot of pre-harvest testing and should be recognized for that effort that's been going on for many years. But the baby steps are in the sense that we want to start doing this from a uniform perspective, making sure that we really are using an approach where we have confidence in the results moving forward, and that we can start using that data to help improve our metrics at the farm gate level. And then we can then start moving forward maybe with other type of testing scenarios, whether that's at harvest or, as I mentioned, we're currently not at the facility level, but that is something that could be potentially discussed in the future.
Got it. Couple points of clarification that are being requested within the chat. One, you mentioned, Greg, I think many people are doing around the 1 acre mark, up to 5 acres. Is there a limit in terms of acreage where this testing would need to be done if the risk assessment dictates it? And the comment was, there had been talk of the 40 acres. And I know that you referenced, I think the word you were looking for was
thought experiment.
Thought experiment, yeah. Our thought experiment, to clarify, and that is posted on the United Fresh website, but the purpose of that and where the 45 acres came from was predetermined. So that wasn't something that we had established. That was the actual size associated with an outbreak. So Greg, can you provide some clarification on any size limits in terms of growing acreage?
Sure. So first and foremost, our risk-based pre-harvest testing requirement goes to the 1 acre max. Okay, so we're at a minimum of N equals 60, 1,500 grams per acre, regardless of the commodity that's being tested. Now, as far as total number of acres, that to some degree will also be determined by the guidance that we created as an industry. And so some of the distances that are part of our guidance really do, basically allow the industry to know exactly where maybe that endpoint is for them as far as what acres fall under that enhanced risk or not. It's depending on the type of operation or the type of change that they've noticed that may cause an enhanced risk. Those borders are pretty well spelled out in some of our guidance materials, but there isn't a max per se. But the requirement right now is per acre, 1,500 grams, minimum N equals 60. So.
Great. Tim, a question for you: when will enforcement begin? So, what's the timeline look like here?
So we've got a disciplined process around this. So we have a training session with our auditors that's scheduled for October. And so it wouldn't be until after our auditors have been trained. Now, as most people know, by that time we're beginning that transition down to the desert. So we would expect that this will be audited within the desert, within the California desert region, and then of course implemented widely as we come back to Salinas in the spring.
All right. Greg, another point of clarification for you. Does this, or the decision to do pre-harvest testing, does it influence or impact any of the other California LGMA requirements? And the question was specifically about water. The way the question was stated was that there wasn't direct application of water 21 days before harvest, which I think is missing some important details within that. But are there, I guess, can pre-harvest testing be used in lieu of some of the other requirements of the LGMA?
Yeah, and so that's a great question, and the answer is no. To just be very blunt about it. But what I want to make sure that folks understand is that pre-harvest testing isn't a silver bullet. It's not this this mitigation that if you do pre-harvest testing that you'll capture potential failures of your own food safety program or your own mitigations. Our requirements are our requirements. They're very clear, very spelled out. We do not, for instance, when it comes to water treatment or our water requirements, we do not rely on pre-harvest testing as a quote unquote get out of jail free card, if you will. Again, really the goal of the pre-harvest testing, just so again, we kind of beat the dead horse a little bit, but is to verify what's happening, verify your mitigations, verify your food safety program, and to start gathering data regarding what's happening in our environments when the grower or handler perceives there's an enhanced risk, so that we can truly start to understand, are these truly enhanced risks or are they not, and start making adjustments to our metrics as the data allows us to understand that better.
Another question, I continue to see a lot of questions coming in around pooling samples. And so maybe rather than asking the specific questions, because I know that you answered some of those earlier, will the California LGMA be putting out more guidance, more detail on this topic of how you decide your number of samples, the compositing, pooling? Will there be any more guidance to help people? Because there are a surprising number of questions that continue to come into the chat on this topic.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense, right? Obviously, pooling could potentially reduce some of the costs associated with this new sampling requirement. So it's totally understandable. Yeah, so the answer is yes, there's definitely more guidance that's going to come out with that. I know literally we were on a call with Western Growers the other day regarding resources and training materials that are currently being developed and that we're going to be partnering on moving forward. I will say this, I saw one of the comments about proprietary and some of the other the legal requirements of pooling and who can do it and who can't, and some of that that's happening with the labs. I'm not an expert on that. Obviously that's a conversation again you have to have with your lab regarding if their lab can actually do it, legally do it, and all those types of things. But we totally understand why the question of pooling is coming up, and obviously we plan to have a lot more information about that moving forward.
Great. There are a few questions, Greg, if you're willing to answer a couple more questions related to the risk assessment. So are there specifics on how this risk assessment should be conducted? What will be the verification, I guess, that a risk assessment was properly conducted, or that pre-harvest testing occurred when it should have? And I'm curious this is my own question that I didn't put in the chat, but related is you talked about the survey results and the members who are doing pre-harvest testing now. Is it based on risk? And do you expect that people, as a result of going through this structured risk assessment process, will be doing more pre-harvest testing? How do you enforce and standardize the application of the risk assessment?
Oh, great question, Jennifer. Thank you. So, there was this one slide that had, the arrows kind of in a circular process, right? And so the general requirements will be, next week, literally next week, our board will be finalizing our metrics for this year, and the updates regarding pre-harvest testing will become standardized. So we'll have those as legal requirements moving forward for our members. Now, from that perspective, the next step for us is we update our audit checklist and our audit process, right? So the audit checklist gets updated. We have an approval process that we work through the CDFA and the USDA on approving our updates to that. we make sure that all of our questions are auditable, right? So that's really important when it comes to this kind of verification process that you're mentioning. And then at that point, we have training with our auditors, make sure they understand fully what the intentions are, what the expectations are from a review perspective, like what type of information should they be looking for in order to verify that this is actually occurring. And then when they actually conduct an audit, part of that audit is a document review. So when they go out to a particular farm and they're reviewing a particular harvest, there has to be a pre-harvest assessment and a pre-season assessment that was conducted with those farms that will be reviewed. At that moment, the auditor will note what was stated in those pre-harvest assessments, and then they actually go to the farm itself and review the entire farm against those risk assessments, against those pre-season and pre-harvest assessments. And if there are any type of variations between what was actually stated in the document versus what is reality, that will be brought up at that time. And then if there are notes of the requirement to do pre-harvest testing due to an enhanced risk from these risk assessments or pre-season and pre-harvest assessments, then the auditor will then be triggered to ask the next questions. Okay, you have this enhanced risk, show me your pre-harvest testing results. And if there was a positive, obviously they shouldn't be harvesting that product. But if there's a negative, then where's the root cause analysis to go along with that? So there will be this kind of chain of events that go along with the verification process.
Your answer definitely segues into my next question, which combines two questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Do people ever find pathogen positives? And then there was a question about, do we have a sense of what those root cause analyses, what they've found? So ultimately, where might there be pathogens, and how does that influence the risk assessment piece? How does that influence the root cause analysis piece?
Yeah.
Greg, do you want to start, and then Tim can chime in?
You bet. So the answer is yes, there have been positives. It's very, very infrequent. And that's obviously what our survey showed, and also just experience, obviously, I have experience in the industry, did these programs myself in the past. And, again, some of the subject matter experts that we worked with, and some, there's a lot of folks that have experience with this that have kind of shared some of their information to kind of help us with developing these programs. Now, with that said, again, what is the reason behind not finding or finding positives? The belief, which is probably an accurate statement, is that there isn't a lot of contamination out there in the first place, right? And that's why it's a risk-based approach as opposed to test everything, because that's probably not really practical, right? And there's some, obviously, not some. There's many farms where these enhanced risks just aren't present, they're just not known to be present. And then there are other farms that have more risks than others, and et cetera, right? And so this is really the guiding principle behind this kind of testing approach of risk-based analysis. Now, lastly, from the kind of, again, how much contamination, what does it do? The root cause analysis, honestly speaking, from a one-off positive, we probably don't expect in the initial implementation of these programs, probably for a few years even, that they're going to tell us much. But what they're going to start telling us is, there's going to be information that's going to be removed from the hypotheses, right? So again, there's going to be folks doing these root cause analysis, and they're not necessarily going to, based on one result, not necessarily be able to determine a root cause, but you will start to figure out what's happening, and the questions and answers that are going to come from this root cause will be telling for potential future issues, right? And that's really the hope, is that we can start learning what even a no, like when a root cause doesn't determine something, we still can learn from that. There's a lot of potential learning from those, and that's really the hope. So right now, I know there's folks doing root cause analysis. A lot of that information is kept close to the vest, as you can imagine, right? But our hope is as we move forward, that some of those learnings will be shared as an industry, and of course, even with yourself and others, as we start moving down. Because again, we believe that it's not just going to be impacting the leafy greens industry, it's going to impact fresh produce as a whole once we start learning how these root cause analysis function, and some of the learnings about how to do them appropriately and correctly. So.
I'd add to that, Greg, and you implied it, but just want to emphasize that that'll really help inform our metrics. So for example, with CAFOs, we have required that you may not plant within a large CAFO within 1 mile, but we say if you're within 2 miles, there's an elevated risk. And we may find that 2 miles is not enough, or that it is enough. And so it'll really inform our program moving forward. But again, as Greg emphasizes, that means, sharing of data and information so that we as an industry can learn from it and make the changes necessary to produce safer greens.
Well, I think we're just about ready to wrap up, because I think that you've tackled most of the questions here, but I did want to give you an opportunity, both Greg and Tim, any questions that you've seen come in or that you've received directly that you would like to address, and if not, kind of a closing comment or remark before I turn it back over to Amanda. So Greg, anything that you want to close with?
Well, thanks, Jennifer. I think the questions that were asked during this presentation are pretty much the questions that we receive. Obviously, I think there's a lot of anxiety about this to some degree. Obviously, this is a really big deal. We understand that as an industry. Moving forward, the expectation of us is that we get the information out, how to do this most effectively, to be able to have that resource, that training, those guidance materials to really help the industry implement this effectively. But we also understand it's going to be a learning curve. We understand that it's going to take some time for folks to do this in the way that it's intended. And that's just been the way of the LGMA since its inception. And so we understand that. It's kind of like, we're not necessarily the FDA in the sense of, what's that saying they use, training before you regulate or whatever that is. That's not necessarily our case. When our metrics are passed by the board, they become the metrics. That's the law. But we don't necessarily review those or enforce them until we have that, as I mentioned, that process with the auditor training and everything, right? So there is time to adopt. And then, of course, there's 2 states that we're dealing with, right, that we kind of work with. And at this point, we're California, they're Arizona. There might be some differences there, and we have to work through some of those as well. And so there's going to be these ebbs and flows to this process moving forward. But anyways, just closing remarks, I just want to thank you, Jennifer and United, for hosting this. Thank you for the folks that were on the presentation reviewing this with us, and I look forward to any future questions. And we can share our contact information. If you have any further questions, please contact me at any time. So
great. Tim, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would add, I know that even for me as a non-scientist, I'm impressed by Greg's knowledge and articulation about the issues before us. But, I want to emphasize that part of LGMA's role is to help growers implement these successfully. So we just don't throw out a new metric and then hope everybody follows it. There's a lot of training and support along the way to help growers implement this and answer whatever kind of questions they have along the way to ensure that they are able to effectively conduct a risk assessment, and then where appropriate to pre-harvest testing, and then a follow-up root cause analysis. So all of those things are tools that we either have already prepared or in the process of preparing to help our growers implement and take something that sounds pretty daunting and break it down into pieces that a little more digestible, if you will. So I echo Greg's comment again. Thank you, Jennifer and United, for the opportunity this morning, and appreciate everyone's participation.
Thank you both. And Amanda, I will turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Tim and Greg, for that insightful presentation. And thanks to everybody on the line who joined us today. This recording will be sent out, but we do appreciate you actually joining us live. Now, we hope you found this valuable, and we thank you again. Have a wonderful day, and we'll be in touch.